Good day, everyone. Now we're on Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about tissues. And I've broken this into 3 parts, A, B, and C. And so this will be Part A. Tissue is considered the living fabric because it's made out of specialized body cells. If you'll remember that we have literally trillions of living body cells that make up our body. And these cells are specialized, which means that each type of cell performs a specific function. Tissues are groups of similar cells that perform common or related functions, and the study of tissues is called histology. There are 4 types of primary tissues, 4 categories basically, and I do want you to memorize these. There are epithelial tissues, and of course several subtypes, which is what we're going to be discussing in this part of Chapter 4. Epithelial tissues, connective tissues, there are many types of connective tissues, muscle tissue, there's several types of muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. So these are the 4 types of primary tissue types. And figure 4.1 is actually an overview of these 4 basic tissue types. This is representing nervous tissue. It functions to provide the body with internal communication. It includes our brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. Muscle tissue. Muscle tissue contracts in order to allow movement. There's 3 types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, which consists of the muscles that are attached to bones, and then the muscles of the heart. This is cardiac muscle. There it is right there. Muscles of the walls of hollow organs is called smooth muscle. And we find the internal organs right in here, inside of the body cavities. So epithelial tissue typically forms boundaries between different environments. It protects, secretes, absorbs, and or filters. So it just depends on where in the body it's found. The lining of the digestive tracts and other hollow organs, so that would be the epithelial tissue is on that inner lining deep to the muscle, the smooth muscle. We also find epithelial tissue on the skin surface, your epidermis. And there's also what we call glandular epithelial tissue, and we will discuss each of these types pretty soon. Connective tissues. There are many types of connective tissues in the body. Many of the connective tissues provide the function of supporting, protecting, and binding other tissues together. But connective tissues also include bone, of course, tendons, fat or adipose tissue, and also blood. So we'll be discussing each of these. In order to study human tissue, we need to use a microscope. You can use a compound microscope similar to the ones that we have in the lab. But in order to see these tissues, they need to be stained with some type of a stain. Typically, we'll use like a lavender or purple color stain when we prepare a tissue sample. So the tissue needs to be preserved and then fixed to the slide. It has to be thin enough in order to allow light to come through from the bottom. Remember, on your microscopes, the light comes from underneath the slide. So this is an example over here of the tissues in the integument. And you can see several types of tissues here that make up the integument. The integument is your skin with its associated organs and tissues. We'll be studying this later. Epithelial tissues. Now keep in mind, this word epithelial, that is an adjective. It describes the type of tissue. When we say epithelium, that's a noun describing epithelium, what it is. If you see epithelia, IA, that is plural for epithelium. But what does epithelial tissue do? It forms boundaries and or it secretes. There are 2 main types that we can study by location. There are epithelia, different types of epithelial tissues that cover and or line the body structures. And then there is glandular epithelia that will compose the glands of the body. Overall, epithelial tissue functions include protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, and secretion. 5 characteristics of epithelial tissues. Now, this is different than functions. Keep in mind, a characteristic is a trait that's going to be shared by a group of objects, or in this case, tissues, so that all or most epithelial tissues will exhibit these characteristics. So what are they? Epithelial tissues display polarity. That means there's a top and a bottom. Then they also, most of them have specialized contacts. Epithelial tissues derive support from underlying connective tissues because on their own they're kind of fragile. They need some type of support. So there's going to be an underlying connective tissue to which the epithelial tissue is attached. Epithelial tissues are avascular, meaning they do not have blood vessels, but they are innervated, meaning that they do have nerves that supply the tissue. Also, very important, epithelial tissues can regenerate rapidly. This is illustrating polarity. So polarity refers to the fact that there's the apical or upper or free surface that's going to be exposed to the exterior of the body or a cavity, body cavity, depending on where the tissue is. And there's going to be a basal or lower surface that's going to be the surface attached to the underlying connective tissue. And these actually differ in structure and function. You can see down here, this is the underlying connective tissue. We could just, for example, say this was the epidermis covering the surface of the skin, and this would be the connective tissue deep to that. What do you think is deep to the epidermis? Yes, you're right, the dermis. But anyway, the basal surface would be the deepest layer, just think of in the basement, and this is what's the layer attached to the deeper structure, the connective tissue here. The apical surface is on the top. So that apical surface of the epithelial tissues, depending on where it is, it may be smooth and slick. Many of these epithelial tissues have microvilli toward that apical surface, particularly in the small intestine. The function of microvilli, which are little teeny projections, finger-like extensions, these greatly increase surface area. Some surfaces of the epithelial tissues have cilia. I'm sure you've heard of cilia in Fundamentals of Biology, and we talked about it a little bit with Chapter 3. Cilia are projections from cells that actually will move, and they can sweep things along the surface of that tissue. Epithelial tissues may be dry. The term for that is called keratinizing. Keratin is a strong waterproofing protein that accumulates within certain epithelial cells, and this provides a protection. Your epidermis on the surface of the body is an example, pretty much the only example, of a keratinizing epithelium. The ones that are smooth and slick would be the mucous membranes that line the gastrointestinal tract. So the basal surface, this is the bottom surface of an epithelial tissue. It consists of a non-cellular basal lamina. There's no cells, but it's definitely an organic material actually produced by cells. The basal lamina is like an adhesive. It has fibers that will join to what we call the basement membrane. The basement membrane then joins this epithelial tissue to its underlying connective tissue. The basal lamina provides an adhesive sheet, a selective filter, and it provides a scaffolding for cell migration in wound repair. If you've ever wondered why, if you get a scrape on your skin and it looks really nasty and it's got a big scab on it, but after a while, if it's allowed to heal properly, pretty soon those epithelial cells will just continue to fill in that wound and will assume the shape that your skin was prior to the injury. Now, if it goes deep, that's what ends up with some kind of scar tissue. But a scaffolding means like a form that the cells can use to migrate to fill in a wound. Epithelial tissues also have specialized contacts. Many of the epithelial tissues fit closely together. And these are those epithelial tissues that cover surfaces. They form sheets. The specialized contacts will bind adjacent cells. The cells that are next to one another may be joined by tight junctions or desmosomes. This is showing microscopic images. You have light microscopy, and this is actually an image using an electron microscope, which we call electron microscopy. Another characteristic of epithelial tissues is that they do need to have a connective tissue support. All are supported by connective tissue. The reticular lamina, just underneath that basal layer of cells, is a network of collagen fibers. Collagen is a tough protein. These fibers are deep to the basal lamina. And so with the basal lamina and the reticular lamina together, this actually forms a basement membrane right here, which will join that epithelial tissue to its supporting connective tissue. This is pretty self-explanatory. Epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels, but they are innervated. They are supplied with nerve fibers. Epithelial tissues, and this is important when it comes to something like cancer chemotherapy drugs, which will target very rapidly multiplying cells, cancer cells. It often would have the side effect that epithelial cells can be damaged as well, because epithelial tissue typically has a very quick regenerative capacity, meaning that mitosis is pretty rapid. Your epidermis replaces itself like every 6 weeks. And there are many layers of cells in the epidermis. But what happens is when there's an injury, it may cause these cells to lose their apical basal polarity. In other words, they get turned upside down or sideways. They also can lose their lateral contacts. Lateral, remember, is on the sides. So any kind of damage will actually send a signal to those cells to increase their rate of mitosis. So as long as nutrients are available, the tissue can replace lost cells by cell division, mitosis. So we're going to classify epithelia based on the number of cells, cell layers, and the shape of the cells. So the number of cell layers is either simple, which means a single layer of cells, or stratified. And a stratified epithelium consists of 2 or more layers of cells. Also, we'll include a term that indicates the shape of those cells. Squamous would be squished or flattened. Cuboidal, roughly cube-shaped. And then you have columnar cells. So this is illustrating the classification of epithelia, referring to the number of layers, either simple, with 1 layer of cells, or stratified. Stratified means layers. So you can see in this one there are many layers. So that's the terms that we use to indicate whether it's a simple epithelium or a stratified epithelium. The shapes. There are squamous cells. One type of tissue may have squamous cells, another cuboidal shaped cells, and another columnar shaped. And here is the illustration of that. From the top, you can see that this cell is kind of flattened, and from the side it's very flat. Keep in mind that the nuclei, or the nucleus of each of the cells, is going to assume the shape of that cell. So here you can see this flattened cell from the side, and the nucleus is flat and elongated. It's kind of like a circle if you looked from the top. Cuboidal, roughly cube-shaped. It's equal in depth, height, and width. And the nucleus is somewhat spherical. And we like to point out the nucleus because with the microscope, a nucleus will pick up the stain much more readily than the rest of the cell, so it's often a lot easier to see. Columnar, this is column-shaped, and you can see these cells are much taller than they are wide or deep, and again, the nucleus will assume that similar shape in that it will be elongated. So, simple epithelia, one cell layer thick. Functions are going to be for diffusion, absorption, secretion, and filtration. Of course, these are general functions depending on where in the body this simple epithelium is occurring. This is showing you in the lungs, and you can see these roughly circle-shaped structures here. This is really soft tissue, so they make a slice. These actually would be more like a circle shape because they're spherical, roughly spherical. These are the little air sacs in your lungs. So this is an example of a simple epithelium. Now let's put the terms together. Simple squamous epithelium, the cells are it's one layer thick, and the cells are flattened laterally. The cytoplasm in those cells is sparse, and functionally, these kind of cells are going to be found where rapid diffusion is a priority. And if you think of that last slide, here it is again in the lungs. When you have a single layer of flattened cells, you've got that disc-shaped nuclei, sparse cytoplasm, it functions to allow materials to pass through very quickly via diffusion and filtration. In some parts of the body, filtration happens, such as with capillaries. Capillaries are made out of simple squamous epithelium. And here we see the lungs. And so what diffuses between the air sacs in the lungs and the little capillaries that surround them? Any guesses? Yes, the gases. Oxygen will diffuse from the air that you breathe throughout of this little alveoli and into the bloodstream, and the carbon dioxide that's built up in the bloodstream will pass out from the bloodstream right into the alveoli to the air in there, and then when you exhale, you will exhale the air that's higher in carbon dioxide. We also find simple squamous epithelium at the kidney, in the glomeruli. There are little structures in the kidney. It's a blood vessel, and that's where filtration happens in order to start the cleansing of the blood. And we come back to this in much more detail when we get to the urinary system. Okay, other places we find simple squamous epithelium. This is called the endothelium. That's that lining of a capillary, and it's showing this little teeny capillary is one cell layer thick of squamous or flattened cells. This is actually showing an illustration of white blood cells. When an infection is encountered, they can actually migrate toward the offended area, and they can leak right out from the capillaries into the tissues. Also, during inflammation or at other times, fluid can leak out of the capillaries, and that's called filtration. Also, another place we find simple squamous epithelium is in the mesothelium. In lab, we talk about the various membranes with serous membranes, the serosa. There's that inner layer and the outer layer. Remember, the inner layer is called the visceral layer, and it's a very thin layer, and there's another layer on the other side, the parietal layer. In between is a fluid, the serous fluid, but this mesothelium is a simple squamous epithelium. You may have heard of the disease mesothelioma, and that is actually a cancer of the serous membrane that goes around the lungs, the pleura. And that is often caused by chronic exposure to asbestos. Simple cuboidal epithelia, okay? It's a single layer. The cells are cuboidal in shape. Where do we find these types of epithelia? You've got simple cuboidal epithelia that forms the walls of the smallest ducts of glands and many kidney tubules. The functions are secretion and absorption. And here is the figure that illustrates the simple cuboidal epithelium. And they're showing you right here in the kidney tubules, the ducts and secretory portions of small glands and at the ovary surface. And this is showing you kidney tubules. And each one of these circles would be a cross-section through a tubule, which is a little tiny tube, and you can see these cuboidal-shaped cells, one layer. Simple columnar. It's a simple epithelium, so it's a single layer. The cells are column-shaped. They are closely packed with to one another. And as a rule, all epithelial tissues have cells that are closely packed together. But these column-shaped cells, they look like they're a bunch of soldiers that are standing snugged right up to each other. The functions for simple columnar epithelium would be absorption and secretion. And here's the figure illustrating. You can see these many column-shaped cells that are packed tightly together, and it's one layer. And there it is. This is called simple columnar epithelium of the small intestine mucosa, meaning the lining, the inner lining of the small intestines. These actually have microvilli, which are the extensions, little finger-like extensions at the surface to increase surface area. This is different than cilia. Now, some cell layers on mucous membranes, such as in the trachea, are ciliated, and we'll see that example coming up. But this is showing you simple columnar epithelium. There's another type of epithelium. It looks stratified, but it's not. It's pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo means fake. So it appears stratified, but it's not. And that is because the cells, even though they're only one layer thick, each cell can vary in height. You would see the nuclei located at different levels among these cells. And again, the function is secretion and absorption. This is showing the illustration. Now in this example, from the trachea, we can see that this pseudostratified columnar epithelium has cilia. Cilia are projections into the lumen, or the empty space inside this hollow organ. And they are actually projecting in there, and they move. And these little transparent cells right here, these are mucus-producing cells. They produce mucus, and that will be secreted onto the surface. The mucus can trap dust and debris and bacteria, and then the cilia are moving, and they will move that up toward the pharynx so that the trapped debris and pathogens possibly can then be expectorated or spit out. There are also some simple columnar epithelium examples that have cilia, but not in this location. This is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, those are simple epithelial tissues, one layer. Stratified epithelial tissues will have two or more cell layers. They regenerate from below, that basal layer, the layer of cells that adheres down to that connective tissue at the basement membrane. They will be undergoing mitosis to replace any cells that have sloughed off the top surface. Stratified epithelial tissues are more durable than simple epithelium, and that function is protection. Stratified squamous epithelium, this is the most widespread of the stratified epithelia. The free surface is going to definitely look squamous and flattened, but the deeper layers may actually appear more cuboidal or columnar. The function, protection from wear and tear. So here is the example, stratified squamous epithelium. There's a thick membrane, there's many cell layers, and you can see the top or the apical cells up here toward the apical surface are much more flattened. As you go deeper, they look more cuboidal. And there's actually two types of this stratified squamous epithelium. There is keratinized and non-keratinized. Keratin, okay, the keratinized type, the surface cells are full of keratin and they're actually dead. This is like your suit of armor. This would be your epidermis, for example. So out here, the cells would be dead and flaking off, and then you've got your basal cells, which are active in mitosis, and they are going to then replace any cells that are sloughed off. And it is true, the majority of your house dust is sloughed off skin cells. There's another type of stratified squamous epithelium, and that's a non-keratinized type. This is found in the mouth, the pharynx or your throat, and then the upper part of the esophagus, the mouth, and the vagina. In areas that are close to the outside of the body, this is forming a great protection from any kind of abrasion or friction. So that's where we find the non-keratinized type, and that is actually shown over in the illustration here. That's a stratified squamous epithelium lining the esophagus. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is quite rare. Some sweat glands and mammary glands can be called stratified cuboidal epithelium, and it's typically 2 cell layers thick. Stratified columnar epithelium is very limited in distribution in the body, so we don't even really talk about it much. There's another type of real specialized epithelium, and it's called transitional epithelium. It lines the hollow urinary organs, such as the urinary bladder and the ureters. The ureters bring urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder. So the basal or deep layer of cells will look cuboidal or columnar, and the apical layer, that would be toward the lumen or the space inside of the organ, will change shape as that, or if the organ is being stretched. So they will have a slightly different shape. If the organ is stretched, they actually become squamous. If it's empty and not stretched, they appear more cuboidal. So this is showing you an example from lining the bladder. You've got this transitional epithelium. It looks like a stratified epithelium, and obviously when they cut through this tissue in order to put it onto a slide, the cells that are at the apical surface look very cuboidal. And you can imagine if the bladder was full or distended, we call it, D-I-S-T-E-N-D-E-D, distended, that means that these cells will become more flattened in appearance. Also the urethra. Part of the urethra, that's the tube that carries urine to the outside of the body, and also the ureters, those tubes that carry urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder, are also made of transitional epithelium. Glandular epithelium. So glandular epithelia does not form sheets. It's actually what forms our glands in the body. So glands are actually one or more cells that make and secrete an aqueous fluid that we call a secretion. These are going to be classified by the site of product release. There's 2 major types of glands, endocrine glands, and then there's exocrine glands. We have an entire unit on the endocrine system, which we'll be talking about endocrine glands. But endocrine glands will secrete their product into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands secrete their product locally through a little tube called a duct. Glands also may be classified by the relative number of the glands, of the cells, the number of cells that form the gland. So here we have endocrine glands. They are ductless. They just secrete their product, which we will call a hormone. All endocrine glands when it secretes a product, it's called a hormone, because by definition, an endocrine gland produces hormones, and it travels through the bloodstream or through the lymphatic system to a specific target organ. So when it gets into the bloodstream, it's going to go all over the body, but there are target organs that will respond to that hormone. Target organs respond in characteristic ways. Exocrine glands, when their secretions are released, it goes to body surfaces or into body cavities through a duct. Exocrine glands are more numerous in the body than endocrine glands, and they secrete their products into a duct or ducts, which goes to the body surfaces or the body cavity. Examples would be sebaceous glands, salivary glands, sweat glands. The part of the pancreas produces digestive enzymes into the duodenum. That's another example. Now, when we classify by the number of cells that make up an exocrine gland, a very important type of exocrine gland is a unicellular exocrine gland. That means it's composed of one cell. The only important ones, though, they're called mucus cells and goblet cells. So we talk a lot about goblet cells. A goblet cell looks like a little goblet. Like a goblet is like a little wine goblet, basically a little glass, and it's filled with mucus. These cells are interspersed in very great number among the epithelial linings of the intestinal tract and the respiratory tracts. The product that they make is called mucin, M-U-C-I-N. When mucin is mixed with water, it becomes mucus, M-U-C-U-S. And this is a picture of a goblet cell, and this is actually an electron micrograph that has been colorized. It's one cell, it looks like a little goblet. And then here you can see the nucleus. This would be, the various little cellular organelles they're showing you. But up here, these are little vesicles that contain mucin. And at the top surface right here, it's going to squirt out this mucin, mixes with water, it becomes mucus. Hence, we call the surface there a mucous membrane, and that is actually an adjective, M-U-C-O-U-S, mucous membrane. Mucus is extremely powerful in preventing friction, so it protects those tissues from damage. Now, the other kind of exocrine gland, based on the number of cells, would be multicellular. So there's many cells, typically. There's a duct plus the secretory unit, which is the collection of cells that are actually making the product. Usually these are surrounded by supportive connective tissue. Okay, and here I'm not going to make you memorize all these types. I want you to understand this figure. Simple duct structure, this means that the duct does not branch. A compound duct structure means that the duct will branch. Tubular secretory structure is exactly as it would sound. It's a tube. It's tubular. And if it's not branched, it's just a tube. If it's branched, it has branches. Where do we find tubular secretory structures? The gastric glands, the intestinal glands. Here is a compound tubular. Where do we find that? This would be in the duodenal glands of the small intestine. The duodenum is the very first part of the small intestine. These are showing other types of glands that are alveolar secretory structure. Alveolus simply means a sac-like structure. So we have alveoli in the lungs, which are like little sacs. They're collapsible air sacs. Here, this is called an alveolar structure. See how it's kind of rounded? So there could be simple alveolar. We don't have any of those kind of glands. Simple branched alveolar, the example would be your sebaceous or oil-producing glands on the surface of the skin. Compound alveolar, mammary glands are an example, and compound tubulo-alveolar, which is kind of a combination between a tubular structure and an alveolar structure. That's what salivary glands are made out of. Now, there's actually 3 modes of secretion, and you will notice this is going to be on your study guide. You need to know the 3 chief modes of secretion in human exocrine glands. A, merocrine glands. Merocrine glands will secrete their products by exocytosis. Remember, exocytosis is when a product will actually be spewed out by the cell. Most exocrine glands in the body are this type, merocrine glands. Holocrine glands are a little different, and this is the product is produced in the cell, and then the whole cell ruptures, and that's how the secretions are released, along with dead cell fragments. The example here is a sebaceous or oil-producing gland, and because of these dead cell fragments that are there, it could happen that the ducts get blocked with some of this debris, and if an infection starts, that's what we would refer to as acne. There's a third type of exocrine gland based on how it secretes its product, and this is called an apocrine gland. These cells accumulate the product at the ends of each cell, and only that portion that contains the product, it'll pinch off to release it. Some scientists think that humans don't have any apocrine glands, but others argue that mammary glands in humans may be a type of apocrine gland. And that is the end of part A. Have a wonderful day. I will see you soon.